Welcome to True Drew Podcast, your source for all things Nancy Drew. I'm your host, Avery, and on this podcast, we'll discuss everything from the Nancy Drew books, to computer games, to movie adaptations, and TV shows. Nothing is off the table. So if you're a True Drew, you'll definitely want to tune in for this podcast. Hello guys, and welcome back to another episode of True Drew Podcast. The episode that I have planned for you all today, I don't know if you're ready for it. Today we're going to be talking about a little book that has been highly requested, often contested, the Bluebeard Room. So this is book number 77 in the Nancy Drew series, and it first came out in 1985. And this book and the book that follows it, The Phantom of Venice, both of these books were meant to be backdoor pilots to the Nancy Drew Files, which is another series that came out alongside this regular series in the 1980s. Now, I've gotten so many messages and DMs from you all on Instagram. When are you going to do the Nancy Drew Files? And trust me, I want to so badly because they look so amazing. And they're kind of their own series altogether, and I've been sticking to doing the regular series in chronological order, but eventually we will get to the Nancy Drew Files, and it will be all Nancy Drew Files. We'll go in chronological order with those two, but if you do or don't know what the Nancy Drew Files are, this was a series that came out alongside the regular series, and they were more mature. They were kind of aimed more towards teenagers. I mean, a lot of the books, the titles have murder or death or, some extreme things in them. Poison. I mean, they really went hard with that series. Nancy solves a lot of murders. She solves just a lot of heavier mysteries. There's a lot of darker themes, and they're also characterized by Nancy's many flings. She has various flings with people other than Ned. There's like so many random guys, and she's, on and off again with Ned, so there's a lot of romantic drama. Whereas in the original series, Nancy and Ned are very much constant. They're together. They're in a happy place. And then also the mysteries that Nancy solves in the original series, I feel like it's more like things like tax evasion. She's helping orphans find their long lost inheritance, things more along that line. So as you can imagine, since this book, The Bluebeard Room, is a backdoor pilot to the Nancy Drew Files, it is just full on 1980s. I mean, Nancy dates a rock star. There's mentionings of drugs like I never thought that I would see the day when a Nancy Drew book references cocaine, but here we are. It's so crazy. So I think in honor of that, I need to play a little 1980s music to get us in the mood. Do you feel like you're in 1985 now? Because I feel like I'm in 1985. I want to crack out the hair scrunchies and the leg warmers and just wear a bunch of neon and just listen to a tape deck. Like, I am ready for it. Also, I wanted to give a quick shout out to Tracy. Congratulations on winning a free copy of the Bluebeard Room. I love giving away books on my Instagram, True Drew Podcast. So if you're not following me over there, what are you doing? So first, as always, we're going to describe these book covers. There are 4 separate book covers for the Bluebeard Room. And as always, I like to post these on my Instagram, True Drew Podcast, on Wednesdays if you want to check them out over there. The artist for the first book cover is Hector Garrido. I feel like he has done quite a few of the book covers in the late 70s leading into the 80s, and I kind of like his style. Now, every one of these book covers depicts a very different scene from the book, which I think is really neat, but this first edition shows Nancy, and I believe that is Lance that's with her. They're in some scuba gear, and they're in this underwater tunnel. Like, it's something that happens in the book, which we'll get to, but Nancy's got a flashlight. She's shining it into this dark crevice, and Lance is kind of really close to it. Like, he's a little bit brave. I don't think I'd get that close, but I like the way the artist plays with the light and the shadows on this book cover. We have the flashlight shining off the water, shining off the reflectiveness of their wetsuits, and Nancy's hair is slicked back because she's of course been swimming. But the tagline on this book cover is "Terror and romance await Nancy in this town filled with hidden horrible secrets." Now, the second edition of this book cover, and I own these first two editions in my own collection. This one shows Nancy and Lance. They're both wearing blue jeans. He's wearing like a blue jean vest. Also, Nancy's wearing like a red tank top tucked into her high-waisted jeans, and she's got like a candle, like a lantern that she's carrying, and they're going up the stairs, and if I remember correctly in the book, these are the stairs that lead up from that watery tunnel that they were just in. So this book cover says, Nancy plunges into a dark world of mystery, romance, and terror. Now, the third edition of this book cover shows Nancy in a blue gown, and we see a woman creepily walking across the top of a castle, and this is Nancy's friend, Lisa Harwood, and she's wearing a long, flowing, kind of white, purplish gown. She's got this long, blonde hair, and there's a full moon behind her. It looks really creepy, and this scene depicts where Lisa sleepwalks in the book, and this Nancy Drew book cover has the same tagline as the last one did. Now, this fourth edition of the book cover, I believe this is a UK edition, but it shows Nancy. She's got much darker red hair. She's still wearing like the red top and the blue jeans like we see in the second edition, but this scene depicts Nancy in this secret room of the castle that she has to get into during the book, and there's a portrait of a woman who has blonde hair. She looks a lot like Lisa, but it turns out to be an ancestor of Lisa's. So there's some candles lit below that. I know it's supposed to depict a really creepy scene, but it somehow manages to look warm and inviting. I think it's the color palette that the artist used, but I really like this book cover. It's really pretty, and I usually don't like the UK book covers. So when it comes to giving these book covers a funny cover spoof, I decided to ask my husband what he thought of the first book cover, and he said all access backstage pass, because we have Nancy and Lance looking through this crevice in this watery tunnel, and it's funny that he said that because Lance is a rock star and there's a lot of rock culture in this book, so I thought it was funny that he chose that as his funny cover spoof. It's very appropriate given this book's content, but for my funny cover spoof, I spoofed the third book cover edition where Nancy's friend Lisa is sleepwalking across the castle roof, and I said, BRB gonna NPC, because really, like, Lisa is just like an NPC in a video game. She's just out here, just zoned out, and it's kind of horrifying that she almost falls off the top of this castle, but it's also kind of funny watching Nancy in this book cover, like, running after her. And when it comes to giving these book covers an all-over rating, I would give them all 4 magnifying glasses. I feel like these are great book covers. They describe different scenes in the book, and the artists did a great job. Now let's go ahead and discuss some of the characters that we see in the Bluebeard Room. So first up, I've mentioned his name a couple times, but we have Lance Warwick, who is a rock star. We have Bobo Evans, who is a drummer in his band. The band is actually called the Crowned Heads. There's also Ian Purcell, who was a former bassist in the band, Adam Murr, who's a synth keyboardist, Freddie Isham, who's a bass player, and I believe that's all the members of the band. There's also Olive Harwood, who is Lisa Harwood's mother. She has Nancy go and investigate and see what is going on with Lisa. She's been having some mood swings and just not been herself, and Lisa is a friend of Nancy's that grew up with her in River Heights. There's also Hugh Penvellin, who is married to Lisa, and if that last name sounds familiar, it's because Penvellin works very heavily into the Nancy Drew computer game, number 11, The Curse of Blackmore Manor, which this book is loosely based on. There's also Nigel Murgatroyd, I believe is how you say his name. He's an occult shop owner. There is Eustace Thorne, who's an art dealer. Landreth, who is the Penvellin's butler. There's a Sergeant Weintraub, who is over the narcotics department. I think Nancy encounters him while she's still in New York. There's Colonel Tremaine, a man that Nancy runs into on the train. Ethel Bossany, who is the games mistress. Constable Kenyon, who is a police officer that Nancy encounters over in the UK. Alan Trevor, who is a reporter. Dr. Carradine, and Ivor Roscoe and his wife Diane. So really quickly before I read the synopsis for the Bluebeard Room, yes, this book is what the game Curse of Blackmore Manor is loosely based on. I believe it's also kind of based on the Morsey Manor mystery, or the Mystery at Morsey Manor, which is a later book, but this book has some similar character names. You probably heard Ethel Bossany and Hugh Penvellin and Nigel even, but it's similar to the plot of the game, but it's also very different. But I still think that if you like the game, you would enjoy the book. Okay, so now I'll go ahead and read a brief synopsis for the Bluebeard Room. Romance and danger await Nancy on the craggy coast of Cornwall, England. There to help a friend who could be in danger, Nancy finds more than she bargained for. Lance Warwick, a far too attractive British rock star, puts Nancy off her guard with his obvious desire for her, but she's too busy to give in to her fluttering heart. Rumors of an ancient witch coven still practicing their evil frighten Nancy, but no more than the very modern suspicion that a deadly drug ring is operating on the same shore. A young village reporter, not without his own charms, offers to help Nancy as she attempts to uncover the truth about this tiny, secretive village. Will what she finds solve the mystery and save her friend, or spell the end of Nancy's sleuthing forever? And now for a dramatically read newspaper headline synopsis. Nancy Drew busts drug ring in Cornwall, finds archaeological treasure, and has fling with Crowned Heads frontman Lance Warwick. Okay, and now let's jump into the direct quotes and notes that I took down for the Bluebeard Room. I took like over 20 pages of notes, guys. This is what I meant. You all are not prepared for this. It's gonna be so much fun though. So the first thing that I wrote down that really caught my attention was Nancy is again described in this book at the very beginning as a strawberry blonde with sapphire eyes, and I just feel so happy every time I see Nancy described as having Titian or strawberry blonde hair. Like, this validated me so much as a kid, since I have the same color of hair. When I was growing up, whenever people would describe me, they'd always be like, that redheaded girl, or actually, they'd usually say that girl with the book. But it always made me feel super unique because people couldn't really classify. They'd be like, well, you kind of have red hair and you kind of have blonde hair at the same time. And so in some ways, I felt unique. In other ways, I felt like I didn't fit into either category distinctly. So I've always been so excited that Nancy has my hair color, and I've gotten so many fun comments or DMs from you guys on Instagram saying your hair is just like Nancy's, and that just makes me feel like 10 times cooler. So anyways, Nancy, Bess, and George are in Long Island at the start of this mystery visiting Aunt Eloise, and they're attending this garden party at a mansion on the Sound, and it's all very posh. Like, there's finger foods, I think there's even like a string quartet. Like, you can picture this atmosphere. Or excuse me, I'm sorry, not finger foods, hors d'oeuvres. Hors d'oeuvres sounds so much fancier. Gosh, I laugh a little bit anytime I see the word hors d'oeuvre, because as a kid I used to think it was pronounced whore's divorce. Oh my gosh. Anyways, that's enough about me. I've never been able to pronounce things correctly, but Bess gushes that the rock star Lance Warwick has been spotted at this party, and his band is called the Crowned Heads, and they're from the UK. And the name of this band made me think of the Talking Heads or Casting Crowns. Like, I think Talking Heads formed in like the 70s, and then the Casting Crowns, I think they formed in like the 90s. But anyways, just kind of a mashup is what I was kind of feeling from their name. So George comes over and she hands Nancy a note from Olive Harwood, this woman at the party, who asks Nancy to meet her at the refreshments table so they can talk. And she used to be a neighbor of theirs in River Heights. So Olive wants to talk about her daughter Lisa's recent marriage to this man named Hugh Penvillin. And Lisa and Hugh got married and moved into his family's ancestral castle in the UK. And Olive says she's worried about her daughter because she's acting strange, looks sick, and won't visit home. And Olive wonders if Hugh may be poisoning her daughter. Now, you may think poisoning, that's pretty tame, right? Just you wait. This book is just getting started. So Nancy asks Miss Harwood to elaborate, and it seems like all Miss Harwood has to go on are suspicions and maybe a mother's intuition. But she does make the comment when Nancy asks what motive Hugh would have for killing Lisa, that a lot of these titled Englishmen haven't enough money to keep up their huge estates. And according to her, Lisa has a fortune of her own from her grandfather that she inherited at 21. Okay, so first of all, yet another person with an inheritance in a Nancy Drew book. Like, this is such a trope. But secondly, what Miss Harwood is saying sounds like hearsay or a stereotype. Like, there's not a lot of evidence to go off of here, but Nancy has solved mysteries that have started on much less, so She says she'll give it a go. Now, Miss Harwood does show Nancy a recent picture of her daughter, and Nancy does have to admit she looks gaunt. She looks really sick. But while Nancy and Olive are talking about her daughter Lisa, an arrowhead also falls out of the envelope with the picture, and Miss Harwood says it was in there when she got it. So Nancy remarks it looks like it's from the Stone Age. Miss Harwood also tells Nancy that she'll introduce her to Lance Warwick because he is at this garden party that they're currently at, and he knows Hugh Penvillin, and Miss Harwood had him come to the garden party to help raise money for the cause. Yeah, because this literal rock star would probably not show up to this random Long Island garden party. He was just invited because he has connections to the Harwoods and the Penvillins, and he's doing them a favor. So Nancy lets Miss Harwood lead her over to Lance, who is dancing with girl after girl, and the book describes Lance as wearing a white silk suit with a lavender shirt and tie, and he has blonde spiky hair. The book says he's a mix of Mick Jagger, Billy Idol, and David Bowie. So in other words, a really cool looking guy. So Nancy is annoyed at herself for thinking that he's handsome, and also at how he's dancing with all these other girls. And Lance is just about to come over to her, but Nancy walks off and tells Miss Harwood she's changed her mind and would rather get another glass of punch. Ouch. Now, as you can imagine, a rock star that is used to being fawned over by literally everyone, this is not going to sit well with him, and he's going to become obsessed with Nancy. So at the start of the next chapter, we cut to Nancy, Bess, and George back at Aunt Eloise's apartment, and we get a good description of the apartment. And the book says, Eloise Drew lived in a charming old Victorian apartment building on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. With its turrets and gargoyles and crenellated ramparts, it looked like something out of a gothic horror movie, but Nancy loved its spacious, high-ceilinged rooms and romantic atmosphere. And we also get some descriptions of Aunt Eloise's apartment in the short story Witch's Brew, which is in the Ghost Stories 2 book, which I covered in a bonus Halloween episode last year. But Aunt Eloise seems like she has a really cool apartment. Like, I would live there if I could afford it. But hopefully Aunt Eloise replaced her oven after those firecrackers went off in it in Mystery of the Fire Dragon. So Bess, George, and Aunt Eloise teased Nancy about brushing off Lance Warwick the night before, and Aunt Eloise says Miss Harwood admired Nancy's independent spirit, and George says it was probably good for his ego to be turned down. So while they're all talking about this around Nancy, she recounts how she feels bad for being rude because Lance, it turns out, is actually a nice conversationalist, and he chatted with Nancy as he escorted her through the food line later in the night. So she definitely didn't make the best first impression, but he wasn't completely put off. He found her later and they did talk a little bit, so he knows how to talk and have a good conversation. But at this point, Nancy kind of changes the subject. She doesn't like where the conversation's going, so she asks Aunt Eloise for the name of the man who has an occult bookstore that she wants to talk to. It's someone here in New York, and I guess she knows this from the Ghost Story book also. I think she went to an occult bookstore maybe. But Aunt Eloise says that his name is Nigel Murgatroyd and his shop is called Merlin's Den. And this is obviously where Nigel Mukherjee's name came from in the game Curse of Blackmore Manor. I think they took some inspiration from this guy. So Nancy goes to this occult bookshop and she shows Nigel the arrowhead thing that was in the letter Miss Harwood showed her. She let her have it, and he explains that it is called an elf dart or elf bolt, and it's meant to harm and is very black magic used by witches. And he says someone really wants harm to come to Nancy's friend Lisa. So he shows Nancy a book that's called Wicca, the Way of Wisdom, and he says Nancy can find more answers to her questions in that book. So Nancy tries to pay him for the book, but Nigel just says it's his pleasure to assist America's most attractive young mystery solver. You know, normally people at bookstores just say, hey, are you going to pay with cash or card? And then they put your book in a bag, like, and that's the end of it. Give you a bookmark maybe, but it's just funny that Nancy has this title, like America's most attractive young mystery solver. They always make such a big deal out of Nancy's appearance in these books. She's so attractive to everyone around her, and it's like that doesn't really aid her in solving mysteries though. So after this, Nancy meets Bess and George for lunch at Bloomingdale's, which she calls Bloomies, which I thought was really fun, kind of cute slang. I've never heard it called that. But they do a little bit of shopping and then they return to Aunt Eloise's. Now, I don't know if you've been thinking this the entire time, but maybe some of you are like, oh, where's Hannah Gruen? I miss her. Don't worry, she does get a brief mentioning at this point in the book because Aunt Eloise says she's just enjoying a blackberry cordial that Hannah sent her when the girls get back to her apartment. And that honestly sounds so good. Like, Hannah's so thoughtful also, like, to send Aunt Eloise that. But I want to make some of these recipes that I imagine from the books, and not to spoil anything, but I have the Nancy Drew cookbook. I might try some of the recipes from there sometime. That would be a good YouTube series. But anyways, Aunt Eloise also says that something came in the mail for Nancy, and it's 3 tickets to the Crowned Heads farewell concert at Madison Square Garden. And George looks closer at the tickets, and she sees that they're front row and center. So they all start speculating about the tickets, and the book says Nancy's pulse quickened and she blushed. And I think it's funny though, because just a few books ago in number 74, The Mysterious Image, it said Nancy was not much of a rock music fan. So, I mean, hey, you don't have to like the art to like the artist, but I have a feeling Nancy's a little more excited to see Lance than she is to enjoy the music at the concert. Also, I took note of this because it made me laugh, but Bess exclaims that the tickets are going for like $100 a piece. Now, tickets can be in the thousands, so that just shows how much things have changed. So Nancy, Bess, and George all rush around getting ready for the concert. They're really excited, but the book has Bess and George sniping at each other as usual. Like, we can't have a Nancy Drew book with them getting along. That would just be too normal. But it says Nancy giggled knowing that their insults were all in fun. So normally in the books, we get Nancy just awkwardly just kind of being on the sidelines whenever Bess and George argue. And I really just want to be like, Nancy, just tell George to quit being so mean to Bess. So this was kind of interesting that they included this. Like, it was almost like they were trying to tell the reader, like, hey, it's not that serious. They do this all the time. It's just for fun. But I still think that some of George's comments to Bess are really mean and just off base. There's just some things, no matter how you say them, they're not a joke, you know? Now, after getting ready, Nancy calls Hannah and Carson to let them know not to expect her for dinner tomorrow because she's flying to London on a case. She's agreed to take Miss Harwood's case and go see how Lisa's doing. But I just love that, like, Nancy's life is so spontaneous like this. She's like, yeah, I won't be home for dinner, guys. I'm gonna be in the UK, having fun, living my best life. I'm like, ugh, to have your life, Nancy. Like, she probably got so many frequent flyer miles. But Carson tells Nancy to have fun, and Nancy also mentions to Hannah that she found her a wok she was wanting in Chinatown, and it's being shipped to her. I love how Nancy is so thoughtful, and she thinks of things that Hannah would like when she's out traveling. Like, that was really sweet of her to get that for Hannah. Now, while Nancy's on this phone conversation with Carson, she does ask him his opinion of Miss Harwood, and he says she's very level-headed, and he also mentions that he drafted the will that left the bulk of inheritance to Lisa, but he can't remember all the terms off the top of his head. I just love that Carson is such a good attorney. Like, he has worked for so many people, and we always see these people show up in these different cases that he and Nancy are solving. He's drafted wills for people, he's helped people with business fraud, he's done a little bit of everything. So when Nancy hangs up from this conversation, she calls Miss Harwood to confirm that she's going to England, and she says she'll book Nancy's flight and a room at Claridge's. It's this hotel, I guess, in London, and Lisa is thrilled that she's coming. Now, directly after this, Nancy, Bess, and George go to the Crowned Heads concert at Madison Square Garden, and it's pandemonium. There's a huge, enthusiastic crowd there, and apparently the opening band for the Crowned Heads is an Australian group called Didgeridoo. It seems really on the nose. It's almost like the author was like, what's something really Australian? Oh, okay, let's just call this band Didgeridoo. Like, I don't know what the American equivalent of that would be. Like, what do we have a lot of in America? Tractors? Really high taxes? I don't know. Now, this next thing that I wrote down, I just said I have to read this excerpt from the book for you guys because it's got some amazing imagery about Lance. So, the book says, he was dressed like a futuristic highwayman in a cocked hat and glittering blue metallic tights with pistol bandoliers across his bare chest and his legs encased in silver boots. Sweat beaded his forehead as the music grew louder and his voice rose to a hoarse shout. At times, he seemed to be threatening or sneering at the audience, at others cajoling or making love to it. Then it says, at times Nancy felt certain he was playing and singing especially to her. Just that imagery, just metallic blue tights, silver boots, like it's so good. It's so funny. But also the book says that Nancy wonders if she's managed to capture this rock star's attention, because if so, that would be really flattering because he's always surrounded by girls. And the book also says, from the corner of her eye, she stole a swift glance at her girlfriends. Both Bess and George were staring at the Rock King entranced, their eyes wide open, lips slightly parted. With a shock, Nancy realized that she had been doing the same thing herself. I think I'm gonna play that guitar riff every time something scandalous happens in this book, which is going to be a lot. It's also funny because before the encore, Nancy turns to Bess and George and she asks how they liked the show, and Bess says huskily, "I'll never forget it." And all George can do is nod. So an usher brings Nancy a note at this point, and it's from Lance, and it has the band's insignia on it, which is a cartoon of Lance weighed down by a huge crown surrounded by the members of his band, and the note is signed LR for Lancelot Rex in purple ink. It's an invitation to the press party after the show. Nancy Drew, rockstar groupie. So the crowned heads come out for an encore, and the book says Nancy felt sure now that it hadn't been just her imagination. All those times when he'd paused at the edge of the stage and gazed down through the glare of the spotlights, he really had been singing to her, and now he was doing it again. The book also says that Nancy shivered with suppressed excitement. So Nancy also takes this time to remember very conveniently that she has a boyfriend, and she says that Ned Nickerson is much more her type than this British wild man Lance Warwick. Okay, Nancy, that's all fine and well, but here you are fantasizing about this British rock star. Methinks the lady doth protest too much. So Nancy and her friends end up going to the press party after the show, where Nancy is recognized as the famous teen detective, and there's this reporter who cheesily asks if she's solved the mystery of why the whole town has gone bananas over Lance Warwick and the crowned heads. I just like the fact that Nancy is just as recognized for her sleuthing abilities as Lance is for his rock star abilities, because Nancy's talented. I mean, she's solved over 70 mysteries up to this point. Actually more than that if you think about it, because she's usually solving 2 or 3 mysteries in one book, so I don't even know how many that would be. So once Nancy, Bess, and George are backstage, this woman approaches them and she says her name is Jane Royce, but she doesn't bother to explain who she is, and I just wrote down probably one of the band's handlers, but Nancy notes her fake smile, and she's described as having a beautifully painted face, taffy blonde hair in an artfully styled bush, and she's wearing a silver lame jumpsuit and raspberry suede boots with stiletto heels. Okay, Jane, admittedly, you've got some style, but she's very protective, and she asks why they're there, and Nancy produces the handwritten invitation that she got, and then Jane dismissively says, "Oh yes, you're that one," and she says they can go and join the other girl groupies. Wow. So Bess is not ruffled by this woman's mean girl behavior at all, and she goes and scores her, Nancy, and George a few Cokes and a lemon to share, and she says there's some tasty snacks, and George meanly says, "You're on a diet, Cuddles, remember?" George, why can't you just let Bess have some fun? Now, at about this time, Adam Murr, who's the keyboardist for the Crowned Heads, and Bobo Evans, who's the drummer, come and introduce themselves to the girls, and Adam puts his fingers under Nancy's chin. Kind of awkward. It's like personal space, dude. And he says he remembers Lancelot chatting up this lovely little redhead at the garden party. And he says also, thanks to Nancy, they met the other 2 charmers, Bess and George, as well. You know, I think that's a little bit debatable. I think the verdict is still out on whether or not George is a charmer or not. I think she's very mean to people. So yeah, I'm inclined to say no. She's not all that charming. I don't know though. I just think it was a little weird that this random guy touched Nancy's face. It was a little bit awkward. But the book says that Bobo Evans is from Liverpool and he sounds like Ringo Starr from the Beatles, and Adam is from South London and speaks Cockney in a high-pitched ladylike simper. And the book says Nancy thinks Ned would disapprove of Adam, which is kind of strange. She says She half suspected it was a carefully cultivated act a la Boy George that he was putting on. And the description that we get of Adam, it says he has a face powdered dead white, shiny black hair slicked back in a 1920s movie style, and a long cigarette holder dangled from one limp-wristed hand. I don't know if they're implying what I think they're implying, but it sounds like they're saying that Adam could be gay, or he is otherwise just taking on this role for like an on-stage persona, but I don't know why Ned would disapprove of that. It's kind of interesting though, because if that is the case, the book just kind of skirts around it just a little bit. They just kind of throw it out there and then they let you as the reader kind of determine what you think about it, I guess. In any case, I do enjoy the descriptions of the different band members. I feel like they're very vivid, and I feel like this is some of the most interesting characters we've seen in the books in a while. Now, Bess starts talking to Adam and Bobo, and she tells them that the show was wonderful and they really had the audience turned on. And Bobo remarks, "That's what turns us on, all the birds out there in the concert hall listening to us and loving us." So George takes this opportunity to ask Adam who the creature in the silver jumpsuit is, the woman that was so mean to them earlier, and he says her name is Jane Royce and she's their publicist and a producer sometimes too. And Nancy seems displeased that Jane would have any power over Lance, but tries not to show it. Yeah, Nancy's got it bad. So Adam tows George away while he's interviewed by a reporter, and then Lance comes up to Nancy to talk to her, and he says he got a charge out of seeing her in the front row, and she was a vision of loveliness with those red gold locks. But Lance says he was surprised to see Nancy though, because he didn't think she was much of a rock fan, much less one of his fans. And then Nancy's confused by this, and she asks him why he sent her the tickets, and then he says he didn't send her any tickets. So who did? But when Lance sees that he's hurt Nancy's feelings, he scrambles and says maybe one of the other band members sent the tickets to Nancy because they all knew what an impression she'd made on him. So Nancy appreciates his tact in this moment. Now after this, Lance tells Nancy the press party is just that, for the press, but the real celebration will be later back at the hotel. So he says Nancy's presence is expected and by royal command, since he's the king of rock. Then he puts a cozy arm around Nancy's waist and says he and the band will be along later when this crowd has enough of a buzz so they won't notice. Gasp. An alcohol reference, how risque. Alcohol or much more than that, but this book is definitely more mature than some of the mysteries we've been reading. I can totally see how this was a backdoor pilot for the Nancy Drew files. And can I also say, I honestly love it. The book says that Nancy feels like she, Bess, and George are quickly being relegated to the status of groupies though, so she declines going to the party. And she says they'll have to fly out of New York and she'll need her beauty sleep so they can't go. And Lance, of course, tries flattery and says, "What does a ravishing creature like you need with any beauty sleep?" But Nancy still declines, and she slips away from him and goes to the bathroom in embarrassed tears. And she's upset because she realizes that Lance didn't send her these tickets to the show, and so now she's like, maybe he didn't even want to see me, even though he said he did. So she's just having these typical teenager emotions, like, does he like me? Does he not? I don't know. If it was typical to fall in love with a rock star, I guess. So while Nancy's in the bathroom, she sees a flash of silver leaving the bathroom, and she's annoyed that Jane Royce might have witnessed her distress. You know, it's funny, Nancy rarely passes judgment on people. I feel like she really kind of reserves that, but when it comes to other women who have wronged her, she's not holding back. She really does not like Jane Royce at all. So after Nancy leaves the bathroom, she gets interviewed about her sleuthing, and she then catches up with Bess and George at the refreshment table. And George, of course, is being nasty to Bess, and she says, "Can't we leave you alone for 2 minutes?" Because of course Bess has been enjoying the snacks, which, I mean, that's what I would be doing. And Bess shuts her up by popping a chocolate-covered strawberry in her mouth. Honestly, this is so genius thinks maybe George has just been hangry this entire time through all the books, and she just is taking it out on Bess and Nancy and everyone else around her. I just love that Bess was like, yeah, you know what, George, shut up, and just puts food in her mouth. So after the concert, Nancy and the girls start back for Aunt Eloise's apartment, and Nancy reacts to something in her purse. She just kind of looks in her purse and makes this face, and Bess and George are like, what is it? And she says, I'm gonna just tell you about it in the morning. Oh, if you thought this last chapter was scandalous, get ready, because this next thing that happens is crazy. So the next morning at breakfast, Nancy just casually reveals what was in her purse, and everyone gasps because it's a bag full of white powder. It's cocaine. I can just picture this going down. Aunt Eloise serving everyone breakfast, and she's like, Nancy, do you want your eggs over easy? And Nancy's like, yeah, I'll have them over easy. Also, here's some cocaine that I found in my purse last night. It's not mine, but it was in my purse. No, you have not just fallen asleep, and no, this is not a fever dream. This is a Nancy Drew book. This is so wild to me because the first stories, like the first original 56 books, are so innocent by comparison to this. So Nancy calls up the NYPD narcotics department, and they send over this guy named Sergeant Weintraub, who confirms, yes, it's cocaine, and he asks Nancy how she thinks it could have gotten placed in her purse, and she says maybe at the concert or backstage. She was at the Crowned Heads concert. She tells him all this, but she also remembers Jane Royce quickly leaving the bathroom, and so she wonders if she could have possibly done it. Nancy really does not like this woman, but Sergeant Weintraub comments that it's a good thing Nancy didn't go to the after party that the Crowned Heads had at the hotel, because someone called in a tip that there were drugs and the place was raided. So if Nancy had been there, she would have gone to jail. I mean, Carson Drew is a distinguished attorney, but I don't know if he's that distinguished. Like, I don't know if he can get his 18-year-old daughter off for having cocaine at an after party thrown by a rock and roll band. Like, I just don't know if he has that in him. Not trying to doubt his lawyerly abilities, but I'm just saying, doesn't look good. So at this point in the book, we skip to the next chapter, and Bess and George are returning to River Heights, and Nancy is flying off to London. And when Nancy's going through customs and collecting her luggage, she hears someone say, "Oi there, Red!" And it's Freddie Isham, the Crowned Heads bass player. And he says, "Stone the crows, what you doing here in England, lovey?" That's a very poor attempt at a British accent, but I never said that this was my full-time job. So the whole band, anyway, turns up, and it says Nancy's heart flips, and she can tell Lance is excited to see her too. And unfortunately, Jane Royce is also there, and she's not pleased that Nancy is there, and even less pleased when Lance says he and Nancy are going to have lunch later. They're actually going to do lunch. They're not doing that industry standard thing where they're like, let's do lunch, and then they never do lunch. But Jane protests, and she's bringing up Lance's schedule, and she's like, you have this photo shoot, and you have this, and you can't get out of this, and Lance just tells her to reschedule the conflicts. So when Nancy gets back to the hotel she's staying at, I think it's called Claridge's, she calls Lisa Penvillin and says she'll come out to the estate tomorrow. And at lunchtime, Lance comes to pick Nancy up, and the book says she's wearing a green and white striped silk dress and a straw hat, and Lance wears glasses. And they have to run from the hotel to evade his fans and the paparazzi. I don't know, they make this part seem really fun. Like, sometimes they make this seem fun in movies and in books when people are evading the paparazzi, but I'm sure that's gotta be really annoying and kind of scary at times too. But Nancy and Lance tour London in his little red sports car, and then they have lunch, and Lance says he originally was going to go to Oxford and study to be a composer before he started the band. Now, halfway through lunch, Jane Royce shows up uninvited, and she says that Ian Purcell needs Lance and is having a hysterical fit. Ian Purcell being the former bass player for the Crowned Heads. And so Lance explains that he was the bass player for the band until he got into drugs, and Nancy says she'll go with Lance to go check on him. He's in Polpenny, the city, and Nancy notes there's a connection between him and the Penvillins in regards to Polpenny, which is kind of odd. But as I'm sure you know, all small coincidences in Nancy Drew books end up being sometimes the biggest clues. Now, when Nancy, Lance, and Jane get to Ian's, he's sitting in front of the fireplace in a stupor, drooling, and the landlady says he's been like that for a day and a half. And I can't believe that it never occurred to her to call the hospital. Like, if someone
someone's acting like that, you need to get them help. Like, you don't just let them, like, walk it off. He's just sitting in front of the fireplace, just staring at nothing. That's not okay. So Lance finally calls the hospital, and he says he'll get him checked into a sanatorium because he must have relapsed on drugs. Now, meanwhile, the landlady lets it slip that Ian had a visitor on or before this episode started, so Nancy asks who it was. Maybe there's a connection. The landlady produces a business card, and it's for a Eustace Thorne, who is an art dealer. So naturally, Lance is trying to help his former bandmate, so he tells Nancy to take his car back to her hotel, and he'll just get the car from her later when he takes her out to dinner. So Nancy takes Lance's little red sports car, and she goes to see Eustace Thorne, the art dealer, and he explains that he went to see Ian about this statue called the Golden Mab. It's a bust of an old British goddess named, I'm gonna say this wrong, Maeve. She was the goddess of witches, and Eustace says that the statue resides in the Tate Gallery and it's lent out by the owner. But Ian claimed to have seen a similar statue that faced right instead of left as the famous statue does. So Eustace wondered if it was a pair that was perhaps separated at some point during history, and he wanted to look into it. Also, we have mentionings of witches now. We've had drug references, Nancy having a crush on a rock star. Like, this book just keeps on giving. So Nancy next calls her dad, and he gives her a number for a local law office should she need them. And then Jane Royce pays Nancy a visit at the hotel and tells her not to get too fond of Lance because they're getting married. Holy bombshell. Like, excuse me, ma'am, you're the publicist. This seems like a little bit of a conflict of interest. But Nancy tries to play off being hurt, and she says congratulations, and Jane kind of simpers at her and says, one congratulates the man, dear, and wishes the bride-to-be happiness. So Nancy does, and then Jane asks if she's offended, and Nancy quickly says no. And then Jane stabs out her cigarette and is all like, you and Lance could still dine with my blessing. Ta-ta! What a witch. So the book says Nancy dashes off a letter to Hannah after this, showers, and gets ready while trying to keep her emotions in check. And she apparently decides to wear a sapphire blue dress, which reflects her sapphire eyes and sets off her red gold hair perfectly to her dinner date with Lance, along with a pearl necklace and earrings that Carson got her for her 18th birthday. And when Lance sees Nancy, he says huskily, did anyone ever tell you you're beautiful? And Nancy says, well, let's see now. Yes, I seem to recall hearing that line a few times from my boyfriend back in the States. Finally, we're gonna mention Ned out loud. It's about time. And then Lance retorts, he must be some kind of dork then if it's just a line. You're flat out gorgeous, love. I couldn't help it. From this point on, I started to read Lance's lines like he was Austin Powers. Groovy, baby. Because he kind of gives me that vibe when he's calling Nancy like Love and Birdie and all these pet names. So Nancy and Lance next go to eat at a place called Sousabelle's that is described as 1950s camp. And apparently they're also besieged by eager fans at this restaurant asking for autographs until the maitre d' tells everyone to leave the couple alone. And over dinner, Lance asks Nancy if she and her Yank boyfriend are serious, and she says they haven't decided yet. This makes it seem like Ned actually has a say in the matter when we all know that Nancy calls the shots. But then Lance says it must not be serious based on her answer. So Nancy continues by saying she and Ned have been going together so long that they found themselves taking each other for granted, and they've decided to date other people until they make up their minds. And I guess Nancy kind of feels like Lance is putting her in the hot seat because she turns it around on him and she says, I hear congratulations are in order, talking about him and Jane getting married. And Lance tells her Jane has been wanting to marry him forever, but he doesn't like her like that, and the only reason he puts up with it is because she's good at her job. Lance also says they've had an odd kiss here or there, but it meant nothing to him. Wow, he's a keeper. So after dinner, Lance takes Nancy to the Camden Palace, which is a club, and then they go to 2 more clubs and dance. And this kind of reminds me of that Lady Gaga soundbite that goes around social media from time to time that's like, bus, another club, another club. It's like, we're talking about clubs, and this is a Nancy Drew book. What is happening? So anyways, Nancy and Lance are dancing at this club, and Lance whispers, you're quite a girl, Nancy Drew. When we first met, even this morning at the airport, I thought you were just an exceptionally lovely bit of crumpet. But you're much more than that, you know. You're something quite special. And then they kiss. I don't know. A part of me was really into this rockstar fantasy that Nancy kind of has going on in this book, but then another part of me was like, what about Ned, though? Nancy loves Ned. They are like endgame. It's just so unlike her. So, after dancing at the club, Lance drives Nancy back to her hotel and asks if she has to go to Cornwall, and she says she has to go see Lisa. And she asks how Ian Purcell is doing, and Lance says he's still tripping. But Lance says Nancy can go with him to see him tomorrow, just to check on him for herself, and she agrees. So when Nancy and Lance pay Ian this visit, they talk to his doctor, Dr. Palmer, and he says Ian shows some physical withdrawal symptoms like he was quitting drugs, but he did find a needle puncture on the back of one of Ian's legs that he doesn't think was self-inflicted. And Nancy asks if that suggests anything, and he says possibly someone wanted to drug him to scramble his memories for some reason. So Nancy and Lance go to the Tate Gallery after visiting Ian, and they go to look at the Golden Mab, the statue that was mentioned earlier in the book, and Lance sees Nancy off at Paddington Station and mysteriously tells her he'll see her in Cornwall, and she blows him a kiss. Now, while on the train to go to the Penvillin estate, Nancy encounters a man named Colonel Tremaine, and they talk about the legends of King Arthur and myths and how old Cornwall is, and he also says they don't take fondly to outsiders, which kind of seems like a hint and a threat at the same time. But Lisa Penvillin meets Nancy at the train station in this lemon yellow 1920s or 1930s roadster, which sounds really cool, and she says it once belonged to Hugh's Uncle Nick. I mean, this just seems like a scene straight out of Downton Abbey. Like, you get picked up at a train station in this classic car to go to this English estate, like out in the countryside. What could be better? So on the way to the Penvillin estate, Nancy and Lisa chat and catch up, and Lisa asks about Ned, and Nancy again says they're seeing other people. Like, she's making it very clear. But Nancy notes Lisa looks tired, and she admits she doesn't feel well, and says nothing has gone right since she and Hugh got married. Sounds like there's trouble in paradise. So when they arrive at the estate, Nancy meets Hugh Penvillin, who the book says was a foreign correspondent and is now writing a book on international politics. That just seems like such an aristocrat, upper crust hobby to have. Like, what are you doing? I'm just writing a book on international politics. What are you up to? Just throw in a few ponies and he's golden. I bet he plays polo too. I'm being so judgmental of this guy. But anyways, Nancy sits down to dinner with Hugh and Lisa, but then there's a scream somewhere on the grounds, and Landreth, their butler, goes to investigate and finds someone named Ethel Bossany crumpled next to a bike in their driveway. And I thought it was kind of funny that Ethel Bossany scares everybody in this book, because Ethel in the game Curse of Blackmore Manor also has a habit of terrorizing people. But Lisa says she's a retired games mistress from a girls' school nearby, and when Miss Bossany comes to, she says she was delivering a letter the postmaster gave her for Nancy, but a dark figure stepped out near the gate of the Penvillin's estate and scared her, causing her to faint. And Landreth said he looked around the driveway, but he didn't find the letter that Ethel claimed to be carrying for Nancy. I don't know, it seems a little too convenient, a little bit suspicious. Like, she's trying to maybe score a dinner invitation. She's like, maybe if I just faint and pass out in their driveway around 6:30 p.m., I'll get a dinner invite. I mean, that seems like a lot of effort to go to get some beef stroganoff, but you never know. Now, the next morning, Lisa gives Nancy a tour of the grounds and house, and Nancy notices an iron-bound oak door. And when she asks Lisa about it, she says Hugh doesn't want her to go in there, and she just respects his wishes. Now, I could not. I would have to look behind the door. I would have to know what's behind that door. But Nancy can't help but be reminded of the tale of Bluebeard, who, according to the story, kept a room in his castle from his new bride, and when she opened it, she found the heads of his ex-wives. Creepy. So Nancy after this goes into town and she talks to a constable named Constable Kenyon, and Lisa had explained that no one in town talks to her. They just have kind of ostracized her for some reason, but maybe Nancy is better off going in alone and maybe they'll talk to her. Because of course at the end of the day, we're here in the UK to solve a mystery. We're trying to figure out what's going on between Lisa and her new husband Hugh. We're not here to flirt with rock stars, so Nancy needs to interrogate some people in the town and kind of figure out what's up. So Nancy asks Constable Kenyon if Ian Purcell, the bassist from the Crown Heads, was seen in the area, and if Polpenny Village has a drug problem, and if there are witches, which that's a lot of loaded questions. If I was an officer and someone was asking me these questions, I'd probably be like, what? But he says yes, Ian has visited Polpenny, but he doesn't know the last time he was there. There have been rumors of drugs being dealt and sold at an old abandoned tin mine engine house, but he's never caught anyone, and he's unsure about the witches, saying there's always gossip, but that's all it is. Gossip. And Nancy tries to talk to the other villagers, but they won't engage with her because they know she's Lisa's friend. So her cover's blown. Now there is one man who does approach Nancy, and he says his name is Alan Trevor, and he's a reporter for the Western Sun newspaper, and he knows who Nancy is and why she's there. And he says she may be a girl detective in America, but over here she's Lance Warwick's latest bird, and he knows she's hunting drug pushers and a gold statuette. So this Alan Trevor guy is Nancy's second love interest because she can't just have one other love interest aside from Ned. Just like her mini mysteries, she has to solve many mysteries at the same time, so why would her romances be any different? But Nancy gets mad at him, and Alan just says he's repeating what he saw in the tabloids. So Nancy leaves him in a huff in the middle of the village, and she goes and buys some magazines before going back to the Penvillans because I guess she wants to see what they say for herself. And sure enough, there are pictures of her and Lance running around London together. So to distract herself, Nancy looks for her letter that Ethel lost, the one that she said she was delivering to Nancy the other night, and she finds a purple crowned head's envelope in like a bush near the driveway, but the only thing inside it is another elf bolt, one of those little arrowhead things. So did someone take out the original letter, and is someone in the band threatening Nancy? So after finding this piece of evidence, Nancy goes back to the castle and she overhears a fight between Lisa and Hugh. And Lisa's asking Hugh about the locked room, and Hugh just says Lisa needs to trust him and it needs to stay locked to preserve their happiness, whatever that means. Which, that's a big red flag. I don't know. Like, if you have a room of your house that's locked and you don't let your significant other go in there, like, that sounds a little bit like a problem. But Nancy's embarrassed about overhearing the couple's argument, even though they don't know she has, and she goes down to eat lunch, but Lisa and Hugh don't join her, but Ethel Bossany shows up. Like, this woman is always out for a meal ticket. But she says that she's worried about Lisa, and Landreth, the butler, tells Ethel that Lisa is resting and not accepting any company at the moment, but Ethel rudely just goes upstairs to see her uninvited anyways. So she goes up to see Lisa, and this was really weird, but Ethel starts massaging Lisa's neck and shoulders, and she asks Nancy to fetch her a glass of water so she can give Lisa some of her herbal cordial. This reminded me of Renee from the game Legend of the Crystal Skull. Like, I'm not drinking anything that this woman made me. Like, this is just... no. But the book says Lisa is happy to see Ethel, but this whole exchange is really, really creepy. Like, you don't go into someone's room uninvited. There's certain lines you don't cross. So when Nancy returns to the room, Lisa passes out in Ethel's arms, and Ethel says they should let her sleep. I'm like, she was trying to sleep anyway before you rudely just entered her room without so much as knocking. But Nancy pours the herbal cordial that Ethel was going to give Lisa out once Ethel leaves. Smart move. Now later that night at about 1 o'clock in the morning, Nancy wakes up to a noise and leaves her bed to investigate. And she finds the tower door open and sees a barefoot robed Lisa floating up the stairs. So Nancy kind of quietly follows her. She's not sure if she should wake her since she's sleepwalking, but Lisa leads Nancy to the roof where she climbs up dangerously close to a ledge, and Nancy has to grab her. And Lisa faints and falls back on Nancy, and then Hugh appears out of nowhere. And he has nothing but love and worry in his eyes for Lisa, according to Nancy, who follows him back downstairs as he carries his wife back to their room. And Hugh actually thanks Nancy for her quick thinking. Now Nancy, meanwhile, has something else on her mind, because just before she followed Hugh back inside the castle, she saw a pinprick of light on the moor coming from what looked to be the tin mine engine house, the same one that Constable Kenyon mentioned that sometimes there's been rumors of drugs passing through there. So she throws on a sweater, gets Lisa's bike, and she goes to check it out at 1 o'clock in the morning by herself in a foreign country. There's a reason I'm not Nancy Drew. So when Nancy finally gets there, she sees a pentagram painted on the floor and smells incense and marijuana. And it looks like some kind of witchy ritual has been performed there recently, according to Nancy. And then Nancy hears this music coming out of nowhere. and it's what sounds like an Irish tin whistle beckoning Nancy to come forward. So she goes outside towards the noise and finds herself stuck in quicksand. I feel like the song Dumb Ways to Die needs to be playing here, because why would Nancy go out in the middle of the night without telling anyone where she's going? But now we're stuck in quicksand. So Nancy screams for help, and who comes to her rescue but Alan Trevor, the annoying reporter from the other day. And he gets Nancy out of the quicksand and says he was in the area investigating the rumors of drugs and witch cults. What brings you to the fine, foggy moors of Cornwall at 1 o'clock in the morning? Oh, me, I was just investigating some drugs, some witch cults, just things I like to do on an average Tuesday. But Alan Trevor is at least a gentleman. He makes sure Nancy gets back to the castle okay, and says he won't report on her being near the old tin mine. I mean, if he did that, he would have to admit that he was there too, so that's not too chivalrous of him. But the next day, Nancy gets the name of Lisa's doctor, who is Dr. Carradine, and she goes to pay him a visit. And Nancy asks Dr. Carradine about Lisa's health, and normally he says he can't discuss another patient's problems, but he knows that Nancy is a good friend. This still kind of seems like a breach of HIPAA violations and stuff, but we'll just go with it. So Dr. Carradine says he thinks Lisa is tired and worn down, and a lot of her problems are emotional or psychological and could be manifesting themselves into symptoms like the sleepwalking. So Nancy gives him the bottle that had Ethel's tonic she poured into it and asks if he can test it, and he says he will. And this part was kind of unclear. I don't know if Nancy poured the tonic down the drain or if she poured it in this bottle and then she saved it, but anyways, he's gonna test the bottle either for residue or test the actual sample of this herbal concoction that Ethel made. Now, after leaving the doctor's office, to Nancy's dismay, the tabloids are still publishing things about her and Lance Warwick. And one says that Nancy is a Yank female private eye who combines curves with brains. Ew. Tabloids are the worst. And photographers keep coming around the Penvillen property too, trying to get pictures of Nancy because of her association with Lance. But Lisa tells Nancy not to worry about this and to get ready for a dinner party that she'll be putting on that night. And she even tells Nancy that Ethel can give her a massage, but Nancy declines. What kind of sick hold, first of all, does this woman have on Lisa? The fact that Lisa just buys into everything that Ethel says. She's like, oh yeah, Ethel makes me a green smoothie, I'm gonna drink it. Ethel says I need a shoulder massage, I'm gonna say yes. I don't know. Ethel seems like she has a bit too much of a hold on Lisa. And Nancy is also suspicious at this point that Jane Royce is behind the tabloid stories not going away because she's such a good publicist. She's the best in the business after all, according to Lance, and also Nancy's afraid that Lance has been in on it this whole time too. He's riding this wave of publicity, which would be really sick of him to do. So Nancy gets ready for this dinner party by putting on a little black dress, and the book says Ethel swapped out her tweed for a vivid purple gown that was almost indecently low cut and a dangly copper necklace. And Dr. Carradine and some people called Ivor Roscoe and his wife Diane are also in attendance at this party. And it turns out that Ivor owns the Polpenny Tin Mine, the abandoned building that we were talking about earlier that Nancy got stuck in the quicksand outside of, and the tin mine shut down, but now he owns an ad agency also. And Ethel also compliments him on supporting the arts and talks up the gallery that Ivor and Diane own. So we're learning a little bit about these guests. They have some ties to the art world, and Nancy brings up the Golden Mab statue and asks if anyone thinks it's possible that it has a mate that could be in Cornwall, and the table gets eerily quiet. They're even kind of dismissive of Nancy's theory. Now later, while the men enjoy cigars, Diane catches Nancy alone and she warns her to be very careful. The Polpenny community is very protective of its secrets and she may encounter trouble. Yeah, that sounds a lot like a threat. So after this encounter with Diane, Nancy goes to ask Dr. Carradine about the chemical analysis he did on Ethel's tonic, and he says it's a harmless vegetable compound. Well, at least Ethel wasn't poisoning Lisa, because that's where I thought this was going. Now, when Nancy leaves the doctor's office, she sees a red sports car, and it turns out to be Lance. And he gets out of the car and he's excited to see Nancy, saying that the band took a gig nearby so he could see Nancy. And Nancy says she thinks Jane is behind all the negative press, and Lance basically just tells her, what does it matter? And that plenty of other girls would love the limelight of being Lance Warwick's new sweetheart. I'll take conceited and full of himself for 500, Alex. Okay, because this guy, he talks about himself in third person, gag. Also, he thinks Nancy should be flattered just to be in his presence and be in the tabloids. No. So Nancy tells him she's not one of his groupies and storms off. And as Nancy is leaving, Alan Trevor intercepts her, and he promises not to ask her any questions about what just happened, and he takes her to lunch. That's gotta be some kind of a record or some kind of dance move, because it's like Nancy spins out of one guy's arms and into another guy's arms. Like, I've heard that this is what the Nancy Drew files are a lot like. Nancy is constantly dating these other guys who are not Ned Nickerson. So while Nancy and Alan are at lunch, she asks if he can dig up who wrote the tabloid article on the witch cult of Polpenny, and he says he'll try. Now, after lunch, Nancy goes back to Penvillin Castle and she sees a tour group on the grounds, and I think this is fairly common for castles in the UK, even when people are in residence at them. We toured a castle in Alnwick, which is like in the northern part of the UK, and certain times of the year it will be closed, and sometimes it's open, and there's always private areas that are closed for whoever lives there. That would just be so weird to have people touring your house. Like, I don't know, but it would be cool to live in a castle. That would be really awesome. Now, Nancy takes this opportunity to go to the door of the locked room and examine the keyhole. This is the room that Hugh doesn't want Lisa looking inside of, and it's been oiled recently. So even though Hugh doesn't let Lisa go in there, someone has been in the room recently. And Landreth, the butler, finds Nancy here and says Lance Warwick has called for her 3 times, and Nancy just tells him to tell Lance not to call her again. I think Nancy is officially just unenchanted by this guy. So Lisa overhears this exchange of Nancy telling the butler, just tell Lance not to call me anymore, and she tells Nancy to cheer up. Ethel is coming over to do a seance later. And I was like, I don't know about you, but a seance sure cheers me up when I'm feeling down. Like, what a strange thing to say to somebody who's having relationship drama. Like, hey, you want to just have a seance? Like, that would make things so much better. So Nancy asks if Ethel is a medium, and then Lisa just shrugs, like, I don't know. Like, it's just funny how Lisa puts her ultimate trust in this woman. Like, she just lets Ethel make her smoothies, summon the dead. It's kind of weird. Ethel is a charlatan, in my opinion. That is what she is. Period. Full stop. So anyways, Ethel comes over and she conducts this seance, and she channels the voice of this woman and says, "Nay, I am not a witch. Ye lie, ye black-hearted rogue. Torture me if you like, but I'll never confess to such foul lies." And then she starts screaming, and then Nancy and Lisa have to grab her hands and shake her from her trance. I feel like if someone was going to write an honest Yelp review, or maybe like Angie's List, I don't know, is Yelp just for restaurants, and they did one for Ethel, they would be like, makes a mean kale smoothie, but her necromancy skills could use some work. 3 stars. So when Ethel finally comes out of this trance, she says she had a vision of a blackhorn devil figure who was shooting fire arrows at her and Nancy. And of course, Nancy's unable to sleep later that night, because who would be able to sleep after such a traumatic event? But anyways, she suddenly hears a boat motor out somewhere on the moor. So Nancy gets up and looks out the window, and she sees this boat going to a point nearby, and then also sees a woman walking out that way. And it looks a lot like Lisa. So Nancy's like, oh great, is she sleepwalking again? I guess I need to go get her. This is the true test of friendship. Get you a friend who's going to go out and find you on the moor when you're sleepwalking at 1 a.m. So Nancy yells and wakes up Hugh, and they both go after Lisa, and she comes out of her trance just before she reaches these really steep cliffs and looks alarmed. She's like, what am I doing here? How did I get here? And Hugh comforts her by saying they were just taking a midnight stroll. So Nancy wonders briefly if Lisa could be faking these episodes, maybe to arouse her husband's concerns, but then she quickly dismisses that idea. I love that Nancy is pursuing every angle though. She's looked at Hugh, she's looked looked at Lisa like it doesn't matter if they're old friends or new acquaintances. That's the mark of a true detective. So the next day, Nancy does some research. She goes to the castle library to research hypnosis and the power of suggestion because she's wondering if maybe that is playing a role in Lisa's sleepwalking. And then she calls the Western Sun paper where Alan Trevor works to get his phone number. And once she talks to Alan, he says he tracked down who wrote the witchcraft gossip piece, and it was a man named Coburn. And Coburn told Alan that there were rumors that Hugh's uncle was actually into witchcraft and devil worship. But Coburn also tells Alan that it didn't stop there. It went back as far as the 1700s, all the way back to a woman named Lady Phoebe Penvillin who was accused of being a witch, and she was tortured until she made a confession. Sounds kind of similar to the stuff that Ethel was muttering during that seance. So Nancy then asks if Alan knows anyone who can pilot a boat, and he says he can if Nancy will go on a date with him. So Nancy tells him she wants to look into something, and she agrees to the date. So Nancy and Alan go out in a boat near where she saw the boat in the harbor the other night, and I know what you're thinking, like Nancy on a boat, it's not going to be good, but actually they surprisingly don't have a boating accident, so I don't get to play my little catchy jingle this time. So while they're out there at the point, Nancy notices a cave-like opening, and she and Alan climb up to it and find ropes and ship gear and a chest that says Undine on it, maybe from an old ship. There's also a weird pig drawing on the wall and some old casks, like some old barrels. So Nancy and Alan leave. They explore a little bit, but they have to leave, and Nancy again goes to talk to Constable Kenyon to find out if Ian Purcell ever had any formal drug charges, and he says he'll find out for her. Now after this, Nancy calls Huntley and Dawlish, the law firm that Carson recommended to her, and she asks if they can look up a shipwreck for her, the Undine, the same name as on those crates and chests that she found in the cave. And Lloyd's of London keeps up with all the shipwrecks and shipping logs, which I didn't know that. That sounds really cool. I mean, I guess somebody had to be keeping track of all that, because if you think about it, how did anything get to where it was supposed to be with pirates and all of the stuff, like just all the logistics back in the day? But it would be really cool to see those old shipping logs and what was on those ships. You know, I guess that's what treasure hunters use a lot of times too, to find out which shipwrecks might be worth more to them if they were to find them. I mean, a lot of times it's in international waters and you got to be careful about what belongs to who, but that's still really, really cool. Shipwrecks fascinate me. But anyways, Constable Kenyon calls back and he tells Nancy that Ian did get in trouble and he has a record of drug pushing. Not good. So Nancy kind of files that away for later, and Alan comes to pick her up for their date, and he says they're going to a Crowned Heads concert. This is gonna be awkward. So sure enough, when Lance comes on stage and he sees Nancy and Alan together out in the audience, he gets mad and he says, "What are you doing with my bird?" And Alan tells him to cool it. And when Nancy and Alan go back to Penvillin Castle, he admits he wanted to see how Nancy feels about the rockstar, and he tells Nancy he's mad about her and kisses her. This book is so wild. I love it though. I love it. Like, I have to admit, like, this is one of the most fun books I've read in quite some time in the Nancy Drew series. Like, they're all fun, but this one is just, chef's kiss. So the book says Nancy isn't sure who she finds more attractive, as if that's the only thing that matters. She's also not sure if Alan has just been using her for a story. I mean, so far he's saved Nancy from quicksand, so that's at least one point in his favor, but I don't know, like, you got this one guy, this rock star, who talks about himself in the third person, and he calls Nancy a bird and lovey, and then you've got this guy who actually saved Nancy's life, so I don't know. Maybe taking her to the Crowned Heads concert was a little bit of a lapse in judgment, but I think the choice is pretty clear. Metallic blue pants or tweed. So the next day, Nancy goes to see Ivor and Diane, the people that visited Lisa and Hugh at their estate, and Ivor asks how the mystery solving is going in a sarcastic tone. And Nancy says good and asks him about old tunnels under the mine and if there's one that goes as far as Penvillin Castle, and Ivor stammers that he doesn't think so. Well, then then in that case, there definitely is one. So Nancy runs into Alan again after this, and she asks about going back to the cave by boat, and he agrees. He says they'll meet up later. And Nancy next gets a phone call from Mr. Dawlish, the guy from the law firm, and he reports that the Undine, the ship she wanted to research, sailed from Boston in 1702 and stopped in Cork, Ireland to pick up an archaeological treasure, the twin to the Golden Mab statue, perhaps. According to him, the ship sank and there was only one survivor, a woman named Phoebe Harwood, an old relative of Lisa's. The same Phoebe, I'm assuming, that went on to marry a Penvillin and become Lady Phoebe Penvillin, which this is kind of strange on another level because it's like, how many of the people in Hugh and Lisa's family have married back in like the further generations? Like, what in the arranged marriage is going on here? Like, was that kind of something going on when they got married? Was it a love match? I don't know, but that's kind of weird. It's either that or a really odd coincidence. So Nancy and Alan go back to the cave and she explains her theory about the pig drawing and the casks, which are called hogsheads. So she thinks that this is kind of a connecting clue. So Nancy looks under the casks and they find a hole going downwards. So Alan and Nancy enter it and they find it leads to an underground stream. And Alan says they'll need scuba gear to explore any further and they'll have to go at low tide. So Nancy next goes back into town to rent scuba gear, which seems like an odd thing to find in this little tiny village in the UK, but who knows, maybe it's a shared hobby amongst the villagers. And Nancy runs into Diane Roscoe, who seems overly curious about what she's doing, and Nancy's really vague. She's like, oh yeah, I just like to, go scuba diving, and Diane's kind of like, really? So after this, Nancy goes to the docks to wait on Alan, and he doesn't show up. This really reminded me and gave me flashbacks of Nancy and John McBride in Mystery at Lilac Inn, the revised text, because they go diving, and at one point there's some miscommunication, and Nancy's like, I told you to meet me down here, and he doesn't, so that was kind of cool. But the person that does show up while Nancy's waiting at the docks is Lance, and he shows up in his car with Jane Royce, and he apologizes and asks if he can hang out with her. And Nancy doesn't really say yes or no. She just says, well, I'm going scuba diving. And then Lance says, oh, what a coincidence. I've got scuba gear in my trunk. Which, who does that? Who is that prepared? But Jane Royce gets mad and she asks what she's supposed to do. And Lance says he doesn't care. That was just the best. I love how he's just like, I don't know what you're going to do, but I'm going to go scuba diving. Bye. So Nancy and Lance go to the cave and they go scuba diving and they finally come up roughly under where they estimate Penvillin Castle should be. And they see this iron cage with steps going upwards. So they go up and Lance opens up a trap door and they enter what appears to be a room within the castle, the one that Hugh keeps locked most likely. So in this room they see marijuana, hash, cocaine, and a horned goat head on a wall, along with a portrait from the 1700s of a blonde woman who looks eerily like Lisa, which must be Phoebe Harwood / Phoebe Penvillin, and the Golden Mab statue's twin. And then there's the click of a gun, and out comes Ivor Roscoe, Ethel Bossany, Dr. Carradine, Bobo Evans, and 2 other guys. And Nancy then deduces several things. She tells them that the 2 other men must be drug dealers from London, and the boat she saw was bringing in drugs the other night. And Ethel says she was visiting Lisa and snuck into the room through an old priest hole passageway. And they also took care of Alan earlier in the day. That's why he didn't show up to meet Nancy, and they gave him a sleep sedative. And Diane had warned the group of what she had thought Nancy's plans might be after seeing her rent scuba gear. So then Hugh randomly comes in and asks what's going on. He must not have come in the secret room that often, because I don't think he would have just failed to notice like huge amounts of marijuana and cocaine in there. And Ivor says that Nancy, Lance, and Hugh will be put in the iron cage below to drown as the tide comes in. Wow, talk about being in the wrong place at the wrong time. But luckily, Nancy hears a footstep coming and she yells, Alan, thank goodness you've come. And it distracts the bad guys enough to where Lance can hurl a marijuana bale at them. Oh my gosh, I just can't. The imagery here. Like, is that what you call a contact high? I'm sorry, I had to. But then next, Alan comes in a wetsuit and he's holding a boat hook. Like, I'm just picturing this guy dripping wet in this wetsuit, and then he's carrying this boat hook around menacingly. Like, this is almost as bad as that guy who broke in and beat that guy in The Mystery of the Moss-Covered Mansion revised text, and the police were like, yeah, he was wearing flippers. He was wearing scuba gear. Oh my gosh. So Alan throws this boat hook at the bad guys, and then Hugh kicks the gun out of Ivor's hand, and Ethel tries to escape and Nancy trips her. So the bad guys are all apprehended, and Nancy kisses Alan on the cheek, and then Lance says, hey, don't I rate one? So Nancy gives him one too. I mean, Nancy supposedly still hasn't made her mind up about either of these guys, and really the reality of the situation is she's probably not going to ever see them again because they live in the UK, but it's kind of weird to me that she's offering up like a kiss as a reward. Like, I don't know, that feels kind of gross to me. So Lisa is of course shocked about Ethel's involvement because this whole time she's had the wool over her eyes, and Ethel Bossany can do no wrong. And just, if there's anything great about this mystery being solved, it's that Lisa is free of the clutches of Ethel, because Ethel is just not my favorite character. You really just dislike her in this book, which I guess is kind of the point. Now, at this point, Hugh explains that his uncle was a member of a coven, and when he died, Hugh set out to distance himself from that dark family history by allowing the coven to still exist, but not being a part of it. And unfortunately, though, Ivor threatened Hugh and said he could let the Penvillin name be ruined by telling everyone about Hugh's uncle's involvement, or they could kill Lisa. So Hugh is not completely innocent in this, as far as I'm concerned. Like, he was trying to protect his wife, but he also allowed this evil to exist around him. And Ethel spread rumors about Lisa and said that she was the reincarnation of Phoebe Penvillin to scare the townspeople. So this is really sick on a lot of levels, because Ethel ostracized Lisa to the point where Lisa was probably starved for attention for a friend, because she's living in this foreign country with no one around her except her husband. She's moved away from her mother, her family, and then this woman is basically gossiping about her in town. She doesn't know that because everyone's terrified and won't talk to her. And so when Ethel comes to her with these smoothies and these shoulder massages, Lisa's like, oh yay, a friend. With friends like that, who needs enemies? And Dr. Carradine got the cult into drugs. According to the book, Ian realized that the golden Mab statue was worth a fortune, and he tried to get it, but Ethel threatened him and suspended him in the cage at high tide, causing him to have a mental breakdown. Well, no wonder Ian sat in front of a fireplace drooling for a few days. Like, I think I would be a little bit traumatized by that whole experience. But at the end of the book, Lance and Alan ask who Nancy likes most, and she says that's one riddle she hasn't solved. The end. Okay, so now let's go on to a little segment of the podcast that I like to call What's Cooking. So in this book, we saw mentionings of toast, coffee, tea, Coke, salad and cutlet, salad, prawns, and quiche, Cornish pasties, which are apparently like dough with meat and potatoes inside, tea and biscuits, which I'm pretty sure the biscuits are cookies because it's the UK, and I think that's it. Now on to the things that I think Nancy could add to her resume. So I said that Nancy could consider herself a rock star groupie. She tagged along and went to quite a few of Lance's concerts, and she's also a drug buster. I mean, she busted up this coven that was apparently dealing in marijuana and cocaine in the UK, so good job, Nancy. Now on to the things I liked and didn't like about the Bluebeard Room. I've got to admit it, as much as I love Ned, I loved the many love interests and the romance in this book. It just added some spice, you know, a little bit of interest, and it was definitely more mature, and I could see how these books were geared more towards teenagers, or the Nancy Drew Files, which this book is, again, a backdoor pilot for. It was a lot darker. I mean, there were mentionings of drugs and witch covens, and I mean, this book did not shy away from those subjects. And as far as the things I didn't like about this book, Jane Royce and Ethel Bossany, they were just grated on my nerves. Jane was just annoying, just assuming that she was going to be marrying Lance. But then also Ethel, just the way that she manipulated Lisa's life and made her depend on her. That was really messed up. So when it comes to giving the Bluebeard Room a rating, I'm going to give it a 4.5 magnifying glasses. This was a really entertaining read. It was was full of just so much drama and so many things that I was just like, my jaw was on the floor the whole time, and I kind of loved it for that. So that concludes this week's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. This is a book that's been highly requested for a long time. People have wanted to know my thoughts on it, so I hope you guys liked the episode. As always, thank you for listening, and thank you for following along on my Instagram, True Drew Podcast. For next week's episode, we're going to jump into another book that is also a backdoor pilot to the Nancy Drew Files, The Phantom of Venice, which, yes, the game is based on the book, but it's not really the same in a lot of ways. So if you like Nancy flirting with guys who are also not Ned again and happen to be Italian, and Nancy going to Italy, because who doesn't love that, you're going to really like this episode. Until next time, thank you for listening to this episode of True Drew Podcast. Can't get enough of the podcast? Then check out my subscription series, True Drew Files, available on Apple and Spotify. For Nancy Drew books and merchandise, you can check out my website, www.truedrewpodcast.com. For business inquiries, you can contact me at truedrewpodcast@gmail.com, or you can connect with me on Instagram at True Drew Podcast.